Hey, college sports fans, we are coming at you with a second part now of our off-season series, kind of looking at where the Clemson Tigers stand coming out of spring football and into the fall practice season. It should be a little more shelf life for y'all to pick up on this. And today we're going to get into the offensive side of the ball. We have some great details from two of very good beat writers who have checked out the spring game and the spring practices, and they are going to share their observations and insights with us. I'm Bill Zimmerman. This is the Reign Supreme All-Way podcast, and we are into season 5.
I'm Daniel Shirley. And Bill, everything starts at quarterback, right? We know that everything starts at quarterback. And we've seen this program when it's had great quarterbacks. I think that goes back to, in this era, this current era, Taj Boyd, obviously Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence. Kelly Bryant did a great job the 1 year leading the team to the playoff. I love the Dabo's no good except without a generational quarterback talk. Well, Kelly Bryant wasn't a generational quarterback and they went to the playoff.
Right.
But everybody is that way. I'm sorry, that's the game. That's the sport. So, it's interesting where Clemson is at quarterback and where it is at offense right now with a new old offensive coordinator. Some questions at quarterback and how else the offense is going to fill around that quarterback. And I think that's really the storyline of this coming season. I know the defense, and we'll get into the defense, but the storyline I think of this season is, can this offense get back to looking like Clemson's offense? Because it hasn't been that offense for about 3 or 4 years.
Right. And that gets into tempo quite a bit. And there
Right.
was a lot of debate the last 3 years with the previous starting quarterback, Cade Klubnik. Should they have gone faster tempo? Should they have stuck with a more slow and conservative tempo under Garrett Riley? Chad Morris comes back. He's talked a lot about tempo, but maybe there's a little twist on that. We got some really good insights from John Blau of the Charleston Post and Courier. We're also going to hear from Chapel Fowler of the State during this episode, just like we did in part one of this series that looked more at the big picture of the program. So let's get into a little bit of why John thinks there might be, it might not be automatic that the Tigers are just going to go fast and run 80, 90 plays like they used to under Chad Morris. You're definitely boots on the ground, which, Daniel and I almost every episode make sure to admit that we are not in town and keeping tabs on the team that closely and in person. So let's start with the offense. I think a lot of people are excited about Chad Morris coming back. There are obviously some question marks because he has not been calling plays for years now. There's a change at quarterback, so maybe it's a good time if he's still viewed as a quarterback guru. What do you see as the biggest things that we learned during this spring about the offense?
Yeah, schematically, again, they're probably hiding as much as they can. They don't want LSU to see what they're going to do. But as far as main takeaways, you talk about press conferences. Talking to Chad Morris about just the pace of practice in terms of, players, period three, they're running their tempo drill and tongues are hanging out and guys are, wanting to puke. And Gideon Davidson basically told us the same thing. They're definitely playing at a different pace, at least practicing at a different pace. Whether we see that on game day in terms of tempo, he also mentioned that, defenses have caught up to tempo, so it's about mixing tempo. So I don't know if they're going to be like the Clemson offense from the early 2010s where they're just running down the field. But you're going to see a mix of tempo. And obviously, another big deal was Chad Morris talking about running the football first. That is absolutely the emphasis. And that is basically I don't think it's a shot at Garrett Riley, but I think it was definitely an emphasis in Dabo's hiring of Chad Morris that this guy is going to establish the run. Garrett, infamously strayed away from that at times. Couldn't see that word, and got away from it. So I think that's those are two things we definitely have a better idea about how much we see 12 personnel versus 3 wide receivers, how much we see 2 running backs in the backfield at the same time. All those intricate details, I'm not exactly sure. But as far as the meat and potatoes, we're going to see a little bit more tempo, I think, and a lot more running the football. That's for sure.
John, what did you think of the quarterback play of what you guys got to see? Obviously, you only saw bits and pieces of practice, and it feels like Christopher Vizzina is the starter right now. But then it sounded like Tate Reynolds kind of pushed him a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, again, saw very little actual team drills
Right.
in spring ball, and then we saw a scrimmage where it's like the first team offense versus a bunch of second and third stringers. So it's hard to get an honest evaluation. But for what I saw, I mean, Vizzina is solid. I mean, I will say that he does seem to have a decisiveness about him, that he understands ball here, get ball there. He doesn't seem to really be phased by a whole lot. Whether he's elite at certain things, I can't really tell you yet. I mean, we saw that SMU game, and he at least, gave Tristan Smith a chance to catch a touchdown ball in the end zone. Didn't see K. Klubnik really putting it up like that. But obviously that was against the worst, or one of the worst pass defenses in college football in SMU. So it's take that with a grain of salt as well. But yeah, he is, as Dabo said, the leader, or what was it? He had the pole position coming into spring ball, and he maintains the pole position. So there's a horse race going on, and the two of them, Tate Reynolds and Christopher Vizzina, separated from everybody else in the field. And it's those two running side by side, maybe, or maybe Vizzina a little bit in front still. So Vizzina, again, it's hard to tell from spring ball and the little bits that we get to see. But I think he's at least solid. The question is, yeah, Tate Reynolds, um, as a true freshman, a guy who didn't play most of his senior year of high
Right.
school, is he going to be ready to play a legitimate number of snaps? Is he a guy that's going to be able to go into the other Death Valley and be able to not get rattled? How far along he is the big question mark. Especially again watching a scrimmage where Dabo's blowing the whistle as quick as he can, and sacks galore, and they're not actually getting touched. So hard to tell, but yeah, it's definitely those two, and then everyone else after that for sure.
It's interesting that, at least it comes at a time if Tate Reynolds wants to challenge. Christopher Vizzina is having to learn a new system under Chad Morris after having been under Garrett Riley for 3 years. At the same time, you go back and you look at how even Trevor Lawrence wasn't trusted to start at Texas A&M as a freshman. So you really have to believe that Vizzina is going to be the starter at least out of the gate, and then maybe a little more chance for Reynolds to get more snaps. And then I'm really high on Gideon Davidson, and they brought in Chris Johnson to work alongside him. When you talk about emphasizing that running game, what have you been able to see from those two, and maybe some of the other older familiar names like Iziamume, Haynes, Green, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to the quarterback position, where I think Gideon and Chris Johnson Jr. are the two guys. Obviously Jarvis had a nice game at Texas a couple years ago.
Yeah.
I think we forget about him. Obviously, he's had injuries, and so he's probably the name that people aren't talking enough about. But Gideon is interesting because we saw him last year, averaging about 4 yards per carry. It was solid. It wasn't, elite. So the question is, um, with a year under his belt, is he able to kind of see rushing lanes, able to find things, break tackles, make bigger plays that we didn't really see a whole lot? We saw a couple of big plays in the spring game, but again, spring game, I don't want to make too much of it. But I think he's a more confident player. I mean, talking to him in the spring, he was talking about how there were times last year where he just didn't really even think he was a very good running back. And he had a guy like Adam Randall having to give him, encouragement and really remind him, hey, you're a good player. You're a freshman. It's just going to take some time. And so I think he's been a year in. I think he's a little more confident, a little more mature. I think we saw that again in some glimmers in the spring game in terms of somewhat what he was able to do. I think he ran for over 80 yards, right? So I mean, he had a nice game in that spring game. And then Chris Johnson Jr., that's the guy you bring in because he's the thunderbolt. I mean, he's the potential breakaway running back who's just going to be able to find a hole, get upfield, run for like 80 yards, and just outrun everybody. And so, we didn't get to see that in the spring game. I think he ran for like 16 yards. It was just, not a whole lot of opportunity there. But yeah, I mean, he's a guy that when we heard things about the offense, it was a lot of times how fast Chris Johnson Jr. is. I mean, he is very fast. And he is not Chris Johnson Jr., CJ2K's son. Let's make that very clear. But he has some of those same traits and has the same name. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, he's also one of those guys who can be very versatile in terms of, out of the backfield as a receiver, use him in a couple different ways, almost be kind of like a little bit hybrid slot. So they definitely have two guys there that I think are really, really interesting going into next year.
Be sure to subscribe at youtube.com/Clemson Kickoff. It's free. It's the best place to catch all our episodes, and it's the best place for you to comment with your reactions. You talk about it all starts with the quarterback, and sometimes it even starts before the quarterback gets the ball in his hands, while he has the ball in his hands and is trying to make decisions and run the offense because of that offensive line. And it affects the running backs too. Chad Morris wants to run the ball more this season. He's been very vocal about that. I think that there are a lot of question marks on this offensive line because it was supposed to be a stalwart of last year's team with 4 guys coming back. Those 4 guys are all gone now. You're practically looking at a completely rebuilt offensive line. You've also lost a first rounder in the NFL draft and right tackle Blake Miller. A lot of spots to fill out, and there is some experience there. It's not like everybody's brand new green redshirt freshman or anything like that, but a lot of question marks, no doubt. And I like how John got into this, but you have a ton of opinions about offensive line, and we didn't really talk about your opinions earlier. So I kind of give me a quick nutshell of what you expect.
Well, Bill, look, my offensive line takes go back to when you and I were growing up in the 80s and watching Clemson play football. And I mean, there weren't a bunch of Hall of Famers and a bunch of offensive linemen going to the NFL, but you knew one thing: Clemson was going to be able to run the ball.
Yeah.
And they were going to be able to block up front. And, and we get into the defense later on when we talk about the defense, but you knew Clemson could run the ball. And there was not going to be any problems with the offensive line. And they were strong and they were physical. And it's never been since then, it's never been a strength of this program. Even the 2016 team and the 2018 team, I don't think they were, mauling people off the offensive line, off the snap, but they protected the quarterback and they could run the football. Well, the last few years, they haven't been able to run the ball. And I don't know if that is a commitment thing. It feels like Garrett Riley would give up on the run a lot very easily, but they've got to get back to finding those guys up front, those dudes up front. And look, you know how I feel about offensive line. You can play whatever scheme you want to play, but if you can't block, you're not going to win. And you can do the run and shoot with a great offensive line if you want, or the air raid, the Hal Mummy offense, all those things. Or you can run the option, but you got to be able to block up front. And they just haven't been able to do that the last couple of years. And last year, the running game was awful. It was just awful. So they've got to get back to that. And I'm surprised that they were so bad running the ball last year because I thought the offensive line was going to be better. I think you and I talked about that going into the season. I mean, you got guys back and you feel like, oh, when you've got guys back, you're going to be good at that spot. That's always been a tenet of college football is how many guys you have coming back. Well, that means you're going to be good. Well, Clemson broke that mold last year.
So did Penn State.
In Penn State, LSU, there were others.
Yeah.
And not even just on the offensive line, just throughout the whole roster. So maybe this is a refreshing start with this new group. We're starting to get into just guys who Matt Luke recruited. Not quite yet, but we're starting to get to that point. And how does this new group coming in, these 6 freshmen, how can they help? Because there's Bill, I mean, when was the last time the Clemson offensive line was healthy?
Yeah.
And they're not playing chess with the offensive line just to get 5 pieces out there. So that's got to be a big piece of it as well.
Yeah, Matt Luke, I love thinking about how he gets to finally cook with the groceries he shopped for the most part. This will be a true experience of what has Matt Luke really been looking for in his guys. And then there's the question mark of how it'll dovetail with Chad Morris's scheme. Will that end up being a better fit than what Matt Luke coaches? And will that be a better fit than it was with Garrett Riley's scheme? We're going to hear from Chapel Fowler first. We're going to talk a little bit about how the offense and defense didn't have, starters versus starters, especially in the trenches, and how that transitions into a little bit more of his insight on the offensive line. And then John will get more into the position by position, who seems to be at the top of the depth chart, who seems to be key for some rotational snaps. If we can finally see some rotational snaps out of this Clemson offensive line, been a lot of talk of that in recent years, not a lot of it. Anyway, here come our guests. The spring also left some question marks, like you didn't get to see all the starters. And when they did get to the orange and white game, for the people who went and saw it in person, it was ones and twos against threes and fours for a lot of that. So what do you think are your biggest question marks, one or two things on each side of the ball, when you talk about Clemson getting back into playoff contention, or maybe this year even just vying for a spot in the ACC championship game? What are those big question marks that they have to resolve in fall camp? Not that they were failings in the spring, but we just didn't have a lot of exposure to see what's in store there.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed. It was like a 1-2 on 3 and 4 in the orange and white. I thought that was a good opportunity to kind of go good on good in front of a crowd, but not my decision. We talked about Vizzina a little bit already. I think that's obvious. If you have an unproven starter at quarterback, that's going to be a question. But I'll put offensive line in there as well. I think that the skill position talent Clemson has is really solid. Definitely upper half of the ACC, if not, upper third or better, with those receivers we mentioned, and Gideon Davidson, depth at tight end, Chris Johnson Jr. coming in. But just a lot of guys at offensive line that have been around for a few years and have been okay, but just kind of good, not great. I mean, Harris Sewell, I remember there was a point last season where he just had some really poor, he stacked some poor games in a row and almost like pretty much lost his spot for a few games. I think Jacobs is awesome and is probably like another future pro down the line, but that's a young guy. Easton Ware, maybe the guy at right tackle. He's kind of unproven. It's just kind of a group that I think could have used a transfer to. And I know that they went after one guy who ended up committing to South Carolina from ECU that they were kind of in the mix for, but they wanted to prioritize defense. So I understand that. On the portal side of the ball, that's where you needed more acquisitions, but I think a lineman could have helped. And I think that might be something that comes back to bite them, because the running offense last year, just in terms of where it ranked statistically in the country, it was really bad. For like Dabo's tenure, it was among the worst. I think it might have been the worst since he's been the coach, just in terms of how many rushing yards per game. And obviously we know how much that impacts stuff. So I'd say O-line can make a splash or not make a splash on offense on top of Vizzina.
John, we probably talk about offensive line on this podcast more than most people, and how important it is. And what's again, I know spring game guys are split up and all those things, but what do you think the mix is of the guys who are returning, but these young guys who Matt Luke recruited? I mean, could we see true freshmen playing on this offensive line this year?
It's never out of the question. I mean, we saw Blake Miller obviously 4 years ago step in at right tackle and played his entire career. It's just rare. And I like to emphasize that for people, because we have the recruiting rankings and you look and you see all these 4- and 5-star guys and you think, well, that guy should be able to come in and play immediately. Offensive line, more than any other position, is a very developmental position. I mean, you got to be a big, strong, preferably mature guy. You don't have a lot of Blake Miller. So there's a chance. I mean, when I kind of map it out in my head, obviously Braden Jacobs is the left tackle. That there's no doubt about that after him getting some experience last year. Easton Ware, Dabo said, well, we didn't need to take a portal offensive lineman because we really like Easton Ware. And after a few days into spring ball, like, hey, we feel good about that. Now, does that turn out to be true? I mean, would it have been better if they had a portal guy at right tackle rather than a young Easton Ware redshirt freshman? And we'll find out. He's going to get tested. Those are your two anchors right there. Harris Sewell seems to be the number one guy at center. Dabo seemed happy about his transition there. He said he was a good guard. Maybe he's an elite center. And so Harris Sewell had some ups and downs. So that kind of plugs that. So you're really looking at the two guard spots. And Colin Sadler, is you think would be one of the front runners at guard, but he's been so hurt up and down, kind of inconsistent at times. Elijah Thurman, you would think maybe potentially be the other guard, but he's been hurt for most of his Clemson career. Had some great moments as a true freshman. So I would think at one of those guard spots, potentially, like if you're looking at like a Grant Wise, maybe that's probably the number one guy that I look at just in terms of Dabo's comments, in terms of saying how rare of a talent he is. I think he was like an Olympic weightlifter in high school too. So just abnormally strong for a true freshman. So
Yeah.
he might be the type of guy that could plug in and play at the same time. Yeah, I don't want to put too much of that expectation on a guy, but if it's going to be anywhere, as long as there aren't injuries, obviously at the tackle spots, I think it's at one of those guard spots. You could see a freshman, maybe a Grant Wise. Next one I might say is like a Chance Barkley. But yeah, Grant Wise is probably the one guy I'd probably point to and say potentially, maybe, possibly.
John, they've
Lo-
had a lot of injuries up front the last few years. I mean, that has been a common theme of this. Is there a common thread to that, or is this just kind of fluky stuff that's been going on the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's fluky. I mean, you look at Braden Jacobs got hurt jumping up and down,
Right.
celebrating after the Louisville win. Like, when do you see that? I mean, hurting your foot that way. Walker Parks is a guy they were relying on a lot. He's just been absolutely annihilated by injuries throughout his career. Coming back, really gritty guy, but has not always been available. So some of that, is players, maybe with a little more injury prone, like Colin Sadler's had a back injury, came back from that, then got it hurt again. Sometimes different guys just are a little more injury prone. Sometimes things just happen. Again, with Braden Jacobs, I don't, it's just weird. So, I mean, yeah, it's been a lot for them to deal with, and the offensive line's definitely been affected by that in terms of just the number of ro pieces just rotating in and out, the musical chairs they've had on the offensive line has definitely affected the offense as a whole. You would like to see some continuity there in terms of guys not getting hurt. I'm just not sure how you avoid it. I mean, I guess that's football, but if they could have some better luck there, that would certainly help the offense for Clemson.
some really familiar names coming back in the passing game for whoever the quarterback is to be able to target with Bryant Wesco hopefully going to get healthy. TJ Moore a chance to be healthy again at tight end. Christian Bentoncourt appears to be emerging as a strong contender to be the starter there. Those guys may have a little bit of a leadership role to carry as well. And I'm just wondering, not just the receivers, but across the entire offensive core, is there one or two guys who really seems to be like, hey, he's got to stay healthy this year more than the rest? Is there anyone they really need to lean on, or is this going to be sort of in baseball? You got the bullpen by committee without a clear closer. Is this going to be sort of a real every guy counts kind of effort for this offense?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I do think the one thing that this team has compared to last year is I do think there's more depth. And so if you're to lose one guy, I don't think it's necessarily the end of them. At the same time, I mean, you look at receivers like Wesco and TJ Moore. I mean, you don't want to lose either of those guys. And obviously, for Clemson's offense, when Brian Wesco went out after that injury at SMU, and he's lucky that it wasn't much worse than it was. I mean, the way he flipped and the pressure on his neck and all of that. And so I don't know if there's one guy I point to. I mean, again, I might go back to the offensive line and say if you lose Braden Jacobs and all of a sudden you don't have that at left tackle, I mean, that could be concerning, especially with how much you have to replace next year. I could point to a guy like Gideon Davidson and say, obviously you have Chris Johnson Jr., but if you're riding that guy who's a 6 foot, about 185, 190-pound running back who's not exactly, at least now, kind of built to be that three down, run him over and over again type guy. I mean, that could be concerning. So there's a bunch of pieces throughout. I mean, tight end is the one I would look at and say you could probably lose one and you'd be okay because you still have, if you lose an Olsen Pat Henry, you still have Christian Betancourt, you still have Logan Brooking. I don't know the freshman what he's going to look like when he gets in,
Right.
but there's some depth there. But yeah, I mean, there's pieces all over that if you lose one, it definitely does complicate things. It'd be hard for me to point to one other than, yeah, probably I'd start a receiver and just say, I mean, TJ Moore and Brian Wesco are pretty talented guys. If you lose either of them, it certainly does hurt in terms of your ability to stretch the field or, make some big time catches.
I love hearing that from those guys who have been there all spring, and it kind of changed my opinion a little bit. I was very pessimistic about the offense. We heard a lot of talk about should have gotten a quarterback, should have gotten an offensive lineman out of the portal, and I really was down that they hadn't done more of that. They did bring in Chris Johnson to be sort of that accent piece at running back to Gideon Davidson. Some nice complementary styles there, I think will help. We did hear a good bit about that. But overall, one thing we didn't talk a ton about and maybe took a little bit for granted is the strength of those receivers. And the hope would be that Vizzina, when we saw him going up against SMU and making progressions, I've talked about that in past episodes, like Klubnik seemed to lock in on, one thing, maybe a second thing. If the first thing wasn't there very quickly, he would then lock in on one other thing. But it was always one side of the field. And that should be a beauty of a setup, the scheme that the offensive coordinator is running, it just never seemed to pay off really. And so it was noticeable, even to a layman like me, that you could see Vizzina kind of tilting his head, turning his head, looking at different spots on the field. And if he can bring in more of those options at wide receiver and make them a part of the game more reliably, and not just take what the defense is giving you, sometimes you have to do that, but also at times dictate what they want to do with the offense. Maybe look off that first option and go to the guy you really had in mind the whole time. Wow, could that thing open things up? And Chad Morris has been very good in the past at working with quarterbacks. I think the flip side is Vizzina worked in one system for 3 years. This is a very new system. He's going to have the aptitude to make that change. And if he can't, Tate Reynolds will be right behind him, hoping to get some snaps, won't he?
Yeah, he will. And I hope we see Tate Reynolds get some snaps, right? Maybe it's in blowouts or whatever. But Bill, here's the thing that I think that Chad Morris does as well as anybody. He makes it easy on the quarterback, right? Give him a clear direction of what you want. And I don't know that it was ever easy for Cade Klubnik in the Garrett Riley offense, or Dabo Swinney kept saying it was the Clemson offense. It was pretty clear it was different than what they had been doing in the past. And I'm not a scheme expert. I'm not, I can't break down, the different looks and all those things. But you've got to make it easy on the quarterback. Well, how do you make it easy on the quarterback? You have a good running game, which they didn't have last year. They should be better running the ball this year. You get the ball to the tight end. Well, we saw how much they emphasized the tight end the first time with Chad Morris.
Right.
I mean, Dwayne Allen was as good a tight end as Clemson's ever had. So you've got to do that. The other way you make it easy on them is you have great receivers. And I don't know that they have, remember that group of who all was on that group? Sammy Watkins and Nuke and Sharon Peak and all those guys, that group where there were 6 of those guys all went to the NFL. I don't think they have that. But when you have Wesco and TJ Moore, and if you could keep them healthy, and hopefully Wesco is healthy after that's the scare last year, well, then that slides everybody into a slot. And then you've got 5 or 6 deep at wide receiver. And, it feels like the last, 4 or 5 years, they've been juggling at wide receiver and they've been juggling on the offensive line. And if they can get those 2 things figured out, they can make things easier on Christopher Vizzina and give him a clear path and give him outlets that if the first look isn't there and maybe the second looks like there, okay, well then where's the swing man?
Yeah.
And it never felt like there was a swing man to get the ball to. So then Cade had to panic or make a decision that, you and I did not agree with a lot of the times. And he ends up horizontal trying to throw the ball, and threw it backwards a couple of times. So I think that's the biggest thing is if you give Vizzina a clear picture of what he's supposed to be seeing, you make things easier on him. And that's when quarterbacks succeed. Look, I know the job is hard to play quarterback, but the job of the coaches and the play caller and specifically is to make things just a little bit easier on them so they don't have to, you hear people talking about, oh, he can go to his 4th option. Well, typically you get to your 4th option, you're laying on your back getting sacked.
Even a good offensive line is not going to always give you time to get through 4 options. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I think that's kind of where we've got to get to is okay, one's not open, two's not open. Okay, where's my option here to swing it to and get it to him? I think you'll see a lot more of that in this offense. And Bill, how long have we been screaming for them to use the tight ends more? Even though they've had talented tight ends on the roster the last couple of years, it didn't feel like they were using them enough.
Right.
And I think you'll see that be a bigger part of the offense again.
Yeah, can you picture Olsen Pat Henry in kind of that Garrett Williams sort of role? I can, and then Bentoncourt uh, has that sort of Dwayne Allen frame. If he can be as nimble as Allen or Pat Henry, I don't think he's going to be Jordan Leggett anytime soon, but
Right.
a really good chance to be a strong contributor. And then as John mentioned with Logan Brooking coming in, we just don't know. Like that's kind of a wild card. And what if he emerges in this system as really being adept? Morris is going to want to be able to make quick changes between pass strong tight end, run strong tight end. Dwayne Allen was able to be both of those things.
That's right.
And if one of those three guys can be both of those things at a level that Chad Morris is very comfortable with and encouraged by, that really does open up a lot of things. The biggest thing that will open things up for Vizzina is Davidson and Johnson being able to run the ball really well behind that offensive line. I'll be interested to see also how much Morris's scheme relies on the RPO versus maybe allowing those offensive line to have more committed run plays where they can just surge forward and establish space when they're having to kind of stay on their heels and wonder if it's going to be a pass play and they have to be careful not to get too far downfield where the ref is going to throw a flag. That can impede, some offensive linemen. And so that will be interesting to me to see how Chad Morris with 5-6 years out of play calling kind of has that perspective from stepping back and thinking, all right, should we do something new? Should we have a wrinkle? Should we have something different? And kind of those plans, like you said, for the quarterback to be able to make those adjustments on the fly.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's got to be key. And hopefully, look, I want to see Tate Reynolds as much as anybody, but I want to see Christopher Vizzina succeed. I do. He stuck around in the program. He's exactly what you want college football players to become. You stay around in the program. You don't transfer. I mean, I'm all for kids getting a chance to transfer and players finding a place to play.
For sure.
But that old guy in me that loved college football in the 80s, where you didn't know what the transfer portal was, and guys were going to develop. Dabo Swinney still talks about this being a developmental program.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're hoping for. So you want him to succeed and be able to play well, and they've got to make it easy on him to do that for sure.
Connect with us on social media. That's at Clemson Kickoff. Whether you're on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, or Facebook, you'll find us there. John Blau, Charleston Post and Courier, thank you so much for joining us. Hey, get his newsletter. I love the newsletter. I'm an avid reader of that thing every week and really enjoy having that. So any place else people can connect with you the best?
Yeah, so obviously postandcourier.com. Like you said, the newsletter is called the Tiger Take. And then also my Twitter, I guess, /X. I don't know what we're supposed to call it, but
Same.
is at John_Blau, JON, no H in it.
Chapel, really appreciate it. It's been awesome. What's a great place for people to get in touch with your work?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Twitter is at Chapel Fowler, just first name, last name, and all my stuff is on thestate.com/sports. That's where you can find Clemson, South Carolina, and everything else that we do at the paper.
Our thanks to John and Chapel for joining us in this episode. We have a part 3 coming up. We're going to look at the defense spot by spot. Those two guys will be back as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing what this defense is going to look like against LSU. I'm just like this episode gave me some optimism about the offense. The next episode, the things we talked about, gave me a little optimism for the defense as well. If any news breaks, we'll be sure to bring that to you in between. Until our next episode, I'm Bill Zimmerman for the Reign Supreme Ollie podcast.
I'm Daniel Shirley. Go Tigers.